According to Kenyan author Elspeth Huxley, there are two kinds of history: the scholars' kind, concerning nations and their rulers, and the people's kind, concerning the day-to-day affairs of ordinary folk. This is the story of 18 ordinary women who have lived extraordinary lives. Most of them came to colonial Kenya over 50 years ago, from Great Britain or some part of the former British Empire. They live in Harrison House, a retirement community in Nairobi. All are widows. Europeans who came to settle in Kenya in the early part of the 20th century encountered privileged surroundings. These settlers usually hired ayahs or nannies, cooks, houseboys, gardeners, grooms, or security guards for help with daily living. Being a white settler in Kenya brought not only racial privilege, but the military, political, and economic power that lay behind white occupation of some of Kenya's best agricultural lands. Privilege and power thus provide a central backdrop to the story of the elderly women now living in Harrison House. Early settler women made needlework tapestries that illustrate peaceful Kenyan scenes, and mostly skip depiction of harsh conditions faced by the subjects of colonialism. In 1895, British business leaders began construction of a railroad to the interior, which they hoped would lead to a productive agricultural colony in East Africa. The African farmers and herding groups who had lived this land for hundreds of years experienced violence, forced labor, dismissal of human rights, and sometimes death as a result of colonial expansion. The ex-colonial women of Harrison House are understandably less than eager to speak about the British imperial period. In fact, they may never have been attuned to the ways that Africans experienced colonialism. The women's stories are remarkable, partly because of their acceptance of their place in history. The decision they made to live out their lives in independent, post-colonial Kenya speaks to a level of pride in Kenya's success in achieving a multicultural society, though one that frequently still faces violence and destruction. Why did the elderly women now residing at Harrison House come to Kenya in the first place, so far from home? Why did they stay? What influence has this retirement community had in modern Kenya? British expansion of the empire to all parts of the globe was official policy until the 1960s. Settlers were recruited to farm, develop businesses, preach, and to teach in the East African colony of Kenya. Those who stayed did not know they might live here into their 80s and 90s.
I was at home with my parents, and then my parents decided to emigrate, that's right. And I came with them, of course, and we came out on the Union Castle line, but it took us 3 weeks.
Well, my husband came here and when he was 4 years of age with his family from Jamaica. The governor said to my father-in-law, "Why don't you go to Kenya?" And he said, "Well, where's Kenya?" And they said, "Well, it's British East Africa."
Britain did not accomplish its goals of creating a settler-dominated country in Kenya because, after years of conflict and struggle over land and power, Kenya gained independence in 1963. In fact, settler agriculture had only worked because it was extensively subsidized by the British government.
And it all went off very peacefully, although we had to leave the farm, of course. And the British taxpayer paid for it.
A sense of adventure and zest for living are common traits among the former settler women now living in Harrison House. Aged 99, Gladys Wright remembers coming to Kenya in 1930.
I came out to work at the New Stanley Hotel as receptionist.
Gladys married a young Irishman she had met on the ship, and they ran a farm near Eldoret. It was a hard life, but in a lovely setting.
my husband, made a tremendous success in the farm. We started off with wheat, and eventually we had a mixed farm. Looking back on it now, it was tough going because we were so hard up. I remember we used to send porkers off to the butchers every Monday, and I used to put them in the van and take them in, and I hated them to be going in to be killed. I'm quite stupid about it. I used to scream in defiance because these poor little things were squealing and I knew what was going to happen to them. So I wasn't really a very good farmer's wife.
83-year-old Jean Duda was in the British Army during World War II, doing a variety of jobs.
Bit of everything, actually. Telephone and tried to type very badly and ended up driving the CO around, which was much more my style. I'm not very good at sitting in an office.
In 1947, she and her husband came to Kenya and arrived on a BOAC flying boat.
We landed on Lake Naivasha, and that was my first glimpse of hippos, because there are massive hippos all the way around the edge.
Conditions were crowded, and it was difficult to find a flat in Nairobi. They went to live in Thompson's Falls, where Jean found very different work.
I helped Alan Bobby manage Bella's Hotel. Well, I was taken on officially as a sort of receptionist, come what have you.
Jean's work at the hotel also included tending the bar.
And bar chits, which were a headache because beginning of the evening you could read everybody's signatures, but by about midnight you couldn't make any sense of them at all. Well, there was one chap, he was a very nice bloke actually, and but he got paralytic at about midnight and insisted on us all standing up and singing God Save the Queen. So we all did this quite gaily. And then afterwards, every evening he did this, and afterwards he'd just go plonk off his bar stool onto the floor. And it was quite difficult heaving him out into the other room, so I used to put a carpet underneath, and he'd stay there for the evening. He was sort of around the corner of the bar, so he wasn't sort of in the way too much. And he'd stay there for the evening. Then I'd wrap him up in the carpet, and he'd go to sleep. And next morning I'd take a cup of tea, and off he'd toddle to his farm.
Like many Kenya settlers with British heritage, Jean's father had come to Africa in the early part of the 20th century.
Yes, he came out in it was either 8 or 10, and funnily enough, my husband's father came out at the same time, so they must have known each other, but I wasn't married to him then, so I never asked my pa whether he knew him.
The post-war years in Kenya were a time of no-holds-barred living. Jean was left alone in Thompson's Falls, while her then husband, an architect, travelled on contracts. She bought a vehicle so she could get around more easily.
1924, Hupmobile. Well, I bought it for £10. I drove it all over the place, and everybody was very rude about it. And one night at the bar, they said, "That heap of yours will never even get you to Nakuru, talk about it anywhere else." And I got very uppity and said, "Of course it will." And they said, "I bet you it doesn't get to even Gilgil." So I said, "Okay, bet taken." And so they all put in a bit of money on the bar. And I said, "In fact, it'll go to Mombasa." And they all laughed their heads off and said, and at any rate, I got into the car and I swiped a large bottle of water and a large bag of chips and set off about midnight, I think it was, somewhere around there. And I made it. And I did get somebody ringing up from Teton Day and say, I'm still alive, but I'm halfway to Mombasa.
The youngest resident of Harrison House at age 71, Helen Agarwal settled in Eldoret.
A small, I called it one-horse, up-country market town, a delightful little place. It's about 250 miles northwest of Nairobi.
The women of Harrison House handled their Kenyan adventures with plucky attitudes. They had to tackle food shortages, malaria, primitive outdoor stoves, and driving their cars on unspeakably dangerous roads.
I do not think necessarily Kenya is any more dangerous than any other country in the world. It's a question of using your common sense and being careful. That doesn't always work, and I will tell you a small story about that. We had some friends staying with us and we decided to go out to dinner. There was a rather nice Indian restaurant in Eldoret and we decided to go there. The men, as men do, said they would go by themselves in one car in front of us and we would follow on in a second car behind them. By the time we were halfway along the dirt road, the men had disappeared. They had obviously gone through the junction and out onto the main road and were well on the way to the restaurant. We carried on, stopped at the junction. People walking up and down the road all the time, never took any notice of that. Looked to my right again, and there are three men standing by the car, one standing in front of the windscreen, one leaning up against the front window and the other one leaning up against the rear window. And the one looking through the windscreen has a gun pointed at me through the windscreen. To say I was astonished is an understatement, but my friend sitting by me said, "Go, don't stop, go, go, go." Luckily, I wasn't observing the highway code and I was still in gear and I did not have my handbrake on. So all I had to do was put my foot down and get out of the junction, which I did, and unfortunately fortunately ran over the man with the gun. We got down to the restaurant, we parked the car, rather shakily climbed the stairs to the restaurant to find the two men already sitting at the bar with a drink in front of them. My husband turns to me and says, "Where have you been?" Well, we said we had this slight difficulty at the end of the road and we got held up and so on, and retold the story. And instead of saying, "Oh my goodness, how dreadful, are you all right, are you hurt?" Well, my husband said, "Was it a real gun?" And I said, "Well, I wasn't going to wind the window down and ask him if I could have a look at it." And he said, "Well, was it a revolver or a pistol?" And I said, "I don't know, but it..." And he said, "Well, I suppose you'd better have a drink."
This quintessential settler story focuses on the gun rather than on the fate of the man who was run over. No one knows what happened to him. Many years later, the possibilities of an angry crowd gathering or an arrest for bad driving haunt her. One thing the women of Harrison House learned was that it took very little to make a home in Kenya. Help from servants who aided white pioneers did, however, compensate for material shortages.
When I first came out to East Africa, life was a bit sparse. I considered that it was a very good lesson for me to realise how little, in fact, you could have a very interesting and productive life with. Plastic bags then, although they are now the curse of Africa, were unknown. And if you got hold of a plastic bag, you guarded it like gold. You washed it and you used it and you washed it and you used it until it fell to pieces.
Now age 88, Denise White was born in London and was actively involved in the Blitz during World War II.
Well, I was in the fire service. I was a firewoman driver. Well, I was in London, and we started in. I joined in one part of London, and then after the phony war was over and Dunkirk and all that nonsense, I got transferred to the East End of London. Well, it was very exciting.
Denise came to Kenya in 1958 to marry a man whom she'd met in London when he was on home leave.
So he was gorgeous. Well, I mean, he's 30 years older than me. But, but I fell for him. I didn't realise how old he was until I was hooked.
Her husband had earlier been recruited to come to Kenya to start a factory, the only battery company in sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, after the war was over, he thought he'd like a change, and there was an advertisement in one of the papers in London for people to start a battery factory in Nairobi that put in by Charles Dorman, the coffee people. And so he got the job and came out and started making batteries. And during the First World War, he used to put batteries into submarines. Enormous, about this big, great big things they were.
After Tom died in 1974, Denise ran her husband's company until retirement. By now a Kenyan citizen, she became active in the East African Women's League.
Well, we used to have meetings in my house sometimes, and I won the first prize, a cup, for the best loaf of bread in the show 2 years running. Oh, and I've won first prize for scones, and I can't remember all the other things.
Denise helped her synagogue by sewing burial garments.
Well, we used to buy sheeting. We used to buy sheeting and make the shrouds from a pattern that one of the refugees brought from Russia. And I don't know what year they were brought, but there must have been sometime in the early 1900s. Well, when I went to London one year, I went to see the chief rabbi. Well, I didn't see him himself, but I saw his minions, and they told me where to go, and I met a very nice woman who used to go round to all the hospitals early in the morning to find out who died and who had to have shrouds, because she used to see about making them, and they bought them ready-made from a factory, you see. And here we'd be working hard, doing all these darn things by hand.
Denise continues to support hospice and remembers her husband fondly.
He was full of it, full of life.
1570, I think, or 1574.
83-year-old Dorothy Lepore Trench met her future husband in 1960 when she came from Britain on holiday. Jack Trench was a widower with 2 small children, and Dorothy, a teacher, became a devoted stepmother. Both the long history of her husband's family and her own British history are important memories.
A lot of history, yes, my goodness.
Dorothy continues to enjoy her bridge games, with partners from the outside coming to Harrison House to play bridge once a week. But for Dorothy, it hasn't all been flying safaris with her pilot husband, or being waited on by servants, or seeing to the children's secondary education.
With the talking books for the blind a long time ago, and then I did the hospital trolley for quite a number of years. So I have done quite a lot.
Some of the other residents of Harrison House arrived in Kenya as part of a steady stream of new settlers. Joan came from Britain during the war as a young divorced mother, married a settler and lived on a farm. She was at one time the East African Women's League national chairman. Jean came from Britain, married a settler and became a farm wife, living on the adjoining farm to Gladys Wright. Charlotte, a nurse, came from Britain to staff the Nairobi hospital. Mary was born to settler parents who had come from Britain in the early 1900s. She married a man who was also born in Kenya. The cities, towns, and villages of Kenya simply became home to these women, despite culture and language barriers. There was no going back after so many years here. Together, they averaged 62 years of residence in Africa. Over half the residents of Harrison House have 1 or more grown children living in Kenya. It was a practical solution to live at Harrison House in a setting managed by their common club, the East African Women's League. Early colonial settlers, Ethel and Charles Harrison, built the first stone house in Nairobi in 1911, after Charles came to set up his law practice in Kenya. Colonial East Africa during the Harrisons' time attracted outsiders because of the warm climate, the contrasting scenery, the variety of wild animals, and the diverse people, much as it does today. City life and country life were blurred in the early 1900s. Charles Harrison used to hunt lions with his pistol while riding on horseback near the house, and Ethel Harrison once found a leopard sleeping under her bed. 71-year-old Julian Larby, owner of a popular beach resort in Malindi, remembers how his grandmother Harrison would put him on the train in Nairobi so he could travel to his boarding school after a holiday. When Ethel Harrison moved back to England in 1957 after her husband died, she left the house and 2 acres to the East African Women's League for use by elderly women of Kenya. The 3 adult Larby grandsons recently erected a sign to honor this gift to the League. The current manager of Harrison House was born in Kenya to a settler family. She works with a staff of African Kenyans and reports to the Harrison House Committee of the East African Women's League.
Chickpeas and mint rice. Interesting.
Carol plans menus for residents with special needs, such as diabetics or vegetarians. The manager's job requires a mixture of love, organizational skill, and patience.
Then I've also taught children and adults on horses, and it's not the adults or the children that's been the problem. It was the ponies or the horses. So that was one type of patience that was required. And then I was asked about the Harrison House, and I was a bit worried about it. Anyway, came here, got to know everybody. They then got to know me, and trust and friendship was installed, and slowly but surely, and now my grannies love me as I love them.
Harrison House staff members expanded their horizons in 2007 when they submitted handmade cardigans, shawls, and clothing to the East African Women's League annual Arts and Crafts Show. It was a morale booster for staff when they won a prize for the most items from a group, the Mingi Cup. The domestic staff is unionized, and their rates of pay and benefits follow Kenyan government rules.
I've got a team of 27 staff. I'm number 28.
In 1957, the East African Women's League National Chairman Jean Anderson asked the 60 league branches at the time to each contribute £500 to remodel the original Harrison House. A large wing with upper and lower floors was added, connected by ramps for wheelchair accessibility to the dining room and lounge. For current residents who are mobile, it's about a 5 to 10 minute walk down the hallway to join the other residents for lunch, tea, or dinner. The East African Women's League headquarters is located near Harrison House at the bottom of the garden. There are 24 branches of the League, with about 1,000 members of all racial groups. At the weekly Friday market, one of the League branches sells coffee, tea, and snacks. Members and friends come to chat and buy vegetables, jams and jellies, or whatever is available that day. Proceeds help support the Harrison House facility. Some of the women of Harrison House have an African caregiver who lives with them 24 hours a day, providing for their physical and social needs. Several cannot tell their life stories or why they came to live in Kenya. Others use photos of family to help them remember their early years.
Edith June Woden was my name in my youth. Then I got married, and I married a Watson. An only child, yes, I was. I was an only child. And my mum and dad are here. That's Dad and Mother. And the rest are cousins and brothers and their wives and what have you.
But others clearly remember why they chose Harrison House to live out their final years.
Well, I was getting old, wasn't I? I was getting old. And I thought I had to be looked after, so now I'm beautifully looked after. I suppose the camaraderie, really. You know, everybody's so friendly. And they look after me so well. I mean, really, I'm very lucky. I'm a very lucky person.
Gladys Wright, who opposed raising funds for Harrison House when she was chairman of the Eldoret branch of the League in 1957, now has a different outlook.
Well, I just want to tell the world how lucky we are to have this place. And that we all of us here are emphatic, you know, that we're so lucky to have it here.
Jean Duda gives a high rating to this living community.
No, I think it's great, actually. I looked at a couple of others, but one was out of my financial bracket completely, and the other one folded up soon afterwards. So I came here, and I didn't regret it, actually. It was good. And they're a nice lot of people. I thought when I first came, or at least before I came, that with so many oldies all in one building, that we'd all be at each other's throats, you know. But not a bit of it. Everybody gets on very well.
The East African Women's League and Harrison House have influenced contemporary Kenya in several ways. As the first women's group founded in 1917, the League began charitable activities that continued all through World War I, World War II, the Mau Mau emergency of 1952-59, and to independence in 1963. After troubles would occur in the country, some settlers went back to their countries of origin, while others stayed on. In the 1950s, the Women's League members made tapestries of colonial life, which toured Europe, and were presented in 1968 to the new Kenyan Parliament, where they remain on view as a memory of colonial Kenya. Today, about 16 members of the Kenyan Parliament are women. Women's groups spread throughout Kenya. In 1952, settler women helped form the National Women's Organization, or Maendeleo ya Wanawake, which now has 2 million members. Modern Kenya faces enormous social and political issues, including the desperate struggle of millions of African Kenyan women to raise children and to avoid being trapped in poverty. Nearly every community has a women's group or a mother's group to help support women and children. The women of Harrison House formerly had active roles in outreach projects of the League, such as the Hospital Appeal Fund, a granny project for African grandmothers whose families have been affected by HIV/AIDS, and helping in women's prisons.
Unfortunately, in Kenya, rehabilitation projects in the prison are very thin on the ground, A, because they don't have the funds, and B, because they don't have the staff. But they do have prison workshops where the women make things, knit things, crochet things, sew things, all kinds of things like that. And so they are always looking for materials and so on to help them do these things. And we used to go around to the traders in Eldoret, the textile shops, the knitting shops, places like that, and ask them for their leftovers, their scraps and their bits and pieces. And they would all then go out to the women's prison. And they were very grateful, and they made some lovely things out of them.
The women of Harrison House now seldom venture forth to carry out their volunteer efforts. They watch while others carry the torch to help improve the lives of women and children in Kenya. No one can predict who will take care of the next group of volunteers as they grow old. At present, African women who live to old age are usually cared for by adult children, in their own homes or in a small house on the family compound. It may be some years before a rising African Kenyan middle class turns to Harrison House or builds similar institutions for a new generation of elderly Kenyan women. memories of ordinary people often go unrecorded. The women of Harrison House hold a position in history that has sometimes been interrupted by chaos in the country or loss of family and friends. However, their extraordinary contribution helped the arts flourish in Kenya. They started nursery schools and hospitals. They raised their children with a love of Africa. The women of Harrison House made an individual choice to remain where they receive care and comfort in a land they have made home. Their lives represent a tapestry of the colonial past.